Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and you know Teddy. We're going to see if we can get him into this Friday Reads video and see how long he lasts. Probably not for long, but he has been desperate for affection all morning, and it's actually cooler where we live today. So far, right now, I'm filming this in the morning, and it's about 63 degrees, something like that, Fahrenheit, obviously. And that is a nice change of pace, because usually at this time of day it has been significantly hotter than that, and Teddy has been spending a lot of time, like if I've been in here working, he has been lying in the cool hallway trying to relax, and we'll see how long he lasts here right now as we film this Friday Reads video. If you would prefer to skip to the portion where I actually talk about the books that I have read this week, there will be a timestamp in the description box down below, so you can do that. I actually finished 3 books this week and have barely started 2 new books. We'll talk about that when we get to the Friday Reads portion of the video. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is to sort of loop back to something I mentioned in my most recent book haul revisit video, which will be linked in the description box down below as well, if you would like to check that out. One of the books was missing. I still had it, but I couldn't find it when I went to look for it. I found it. Olivia by Dorothy Strachey. So what had happened? You might not be wondering, but you might be wondering. Who knows? So I'm sure you all probably have bookshelves. So sometimes if you go to shelve something, this is really difficult to do with a dog on your lap. If you go to reshelve something, you accidentally push one book behind the others. That is what had happened. So now that I've gotten all of my books spectacularly out of order, that's what happened with Olivia by Dorothy Strachey. So I found it this week, and maybe that's not exciting to you, but it was exciting to me. So it is still in my library. I don't have to worry about whether or not it will be something that exits. I have to count as an unhaul in previous book haul revisits and all of that stuff. So that was lovely, wasn't it, Teddy? Wasn't it? This has also been a very weird week because there were huge storms in Missoula, where I live, on Wednesday night, and it was wild and weird. So Teddy and Joel has been traveling. He got sent for work somewhere for almost 2 weeks, so he wasn't even home last weekend, and it's just been Teddy and me. A friend invited us to dinner on Wednesday night, and we were at her house. And as we were leaving, we were standing in her backyard because she has these beautiful raspberry bushes, and we were sort of picking like, ooh, dessert. And all of a sudden I looked at her and I was like, is that thunder? She's like, no, I don't think it was thunder. And then about a minute later, the lights flickered, and I thought it was her porch light. And she looked at me and said, was that lightning? I was like, I don't think so. And then almost immediately there was thunder and lightning together. So we said, oh, okay. And I just jumped in the car. She ran back inside, and I got not even a block before the storm hit, and it was bad. Like, it reminded me of when I was living in Illinois as a child, and we would get tornado warnings. I never saw an actual tornado, thank goodness, but I saw the storms that went with them, and it reminded me of that. The only thing that was missing was green sky, which, if you've ever seen it, is really scary. But I wouldn't have been surprised if I had seen it. And already, by the time I got about 2 blocks away from my friend's house, there were tree branches and limbs and things that had fallen into the street, and trees were starting to come down. Missoula, parts of it have been without power since Wednesday night. I'm filming this on Friday. I was fully ready to film my Friday Reads on Thursday and get that whole series where I film on Thursday and then can edit on Friday again. But with the storm, everything was so wild and weird that I wasn't able to film yesterday. So there are parts of Missoula that are still without power almost 2 days later. And it's been wild and weird, and businesses have been impacted. So weird. The good news is it broke the heat wave that we had. So that's something, at least. Teddy is really into this, aren't you? He loves neck and ear scratches. It's his love language. So we're really leaning into it right now. And it was a wild week. Teddy was very concerned about the storm. not scared, but very definitely looking around like, what is happening? And by the time we got home, the power had gone out. Luckily, we got our power back at 3:59 a.m. How do I know it came back at 3:59 a.m.? Because in our house, obviously we didn't have power. There was no air conditioning. None of the fans would work. Luckily, we do have candles and flashlights and things. And credit to all of the people in history who lived by candlelight, because maybe it's just that I'm used to electricity. I don't know that I could do it. And we got home and we were going to sleep downstairs because it's cooler down there. And we have a Christmas village down there, like a permanent Christmas village. We're that extra about Christmas. And it turned on at 3:59 a.m. And some of them have like moving parts, like there's a windmill that does creak when it turns. And we also have a dartboard down there, and that turned on, and it makes this really loud flourish when you turn it on, like ba 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 ba, and it scared the daylights out of me. So thankfully, Teddy was not as jumpy or jittery as I was. So anyway. And the big news that happened since the last time we spoke was, of course, political in nature. I don't know if I even need to say what it is. You probably know exactly. Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race, and Kamala Harris appears to be the new candidate on the Democratic side for president. And, you know, a lot of people sent me messages to say, well, I hope this fixed your anxiety about the election. No, it has not. The anxiety continues because part of the anxiety is just what an unpredictable roller coaster this election has been. And the fact that it is still close is scary. And we're a long way off of November. A lot can happen and there's still a lot of ground to make up. It has been nice to see so many people getting energized about the election. I think that was one of the things that was so scary to me about the election, just seeing people disengage, feeling like they didn't have motivation to vote. And that's why I've been talking about the importance of voting. And I'm still going to talk about the importance of voting because you still need to show up. It doesn't matter if you feel energized now. It's a long way until November in the United States. So you got to stay energized. You got to make sure you are registered to vote. You can check your registration status at the link that I will have in the description box. And if you are eligible to vote and are not registered, you should really do it and make sure you show up in November because so much is on the line. I will say the amount of energy that I've seen, I didn't recognize it right away, which is kind of funny. And then when Kamala released her first actual like campaign ad, it sort of hit me. There's a lingering shot of people with rainbow flags waving them. The fact that they're there, the fact that they linger really like struck me in my soul because it feels like part of the anxiety has been the way the queer community has been targeted by a lot of political people and the way a lot of people have gotten complacent about like, well, I don't want to be controversial and include these things. So seeing a lingering shot of waving rainbow flags in her campaign ad, I was like struck. And it sort of occurred to me afterwards, I was like, is that what hope feels like? Oh, it is. It's good to feel that again. So I am hopeful. Is it fixed or is my anxiety gone? No, because everybody still needs to show up. And it's easy to be excited early on, but, you know, we'll see. We'll see. A lot could happen with the election. Teddy is a good therapeutic support dog, so we'll see how all of that goes. The only other thing to talk about before we get into the actual Friday Reads portion of the video is the big book news that will be next week. Well, as far as we know. Things were a little quieter this week because, you know, we didn't have a list like the New York Times 100 Best Books of the 21st Century. We didn't have a readers list come out or anything like that. I did take a bit of a break because I released 3 videos in a row, the consecutive days last week. So I allowed myself some leeway to remove some stress and not do a video in the early part of this week. So all I released this week was my book haul, which was very large, wasn't it, Teddy? It was just a lot of books, but I love all of them, and I'm actually reading one of them right now. So there was not a lot of that, but next week will be interesting because we will be getting the long list for the Booker Prize on Tuesday. So stay tuned for that. The nice thing about the timing is that I think they're releasing it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, British Standard Time. Is it British Standard Time? I don't know what time zones are called over there. I don't know names of time zones. I know the one that I live in, and I know Eastern and Pacific and Central because I deal with them all the time for work. Anyway, it'll be coming at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon over in the UK, which is the morning, my time. I think it's about 7 a.m. So I will hopefully be able to get a video filmed in the morning, like before work. We'll see how that actually goes. And then I'll just have to edit it and post it during the day. So if all goes well, I will be able to release a video about the long list on Tuesday. Stay tuned for that. And I am not doing predictions. I'm sort of staying out of that. The Pulitzer is my baby. I will do predictions for the Pulitzer. I let other people have fun with the Women's Prize and the Booker Prize. I might dabble a little bit. I save all of my prediction energy for the Pulitzer, and it's fun for me to watch other videos, but what I would say is, if there's a book that you would really like to see on the Booker long list, let me know in the comment section down below. And if there's a book that you would be really disappointed to see on the list, let me know that as well, because it'll be interesting to see if any of those turn up. Teddy is steadily disengaging, and I think he's starting to either go to sleep or want to go, but we'll see. So let me know what you want to see, what you don't want to see on the Booker long list in the comment section down below, and we'll see what actually makes it there. I am not allowing myself to feel excited or even potentially excited about it. Last year was my bitter Booker year. I knew Demon Copperhead wouldn't win the Booker Prize after it won the Pulitzer and the Women's Prize. I had kind of just hoped that it would at least be on the long list, and then it wasn't. And I didn't feel very attached to really any of the books that were on the long list last year. So it was my bitter Booker year, and we're coming off of that. And maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised. I think part of not doing predictions as well is I'm letting other people have a party, and I am attending but not trying to host. And I am hoping that I will be pleasantly surprised this year. And we'll see what happens on Tuesday. And with that, let's get to the actual Friday Reads portion of this video. I'm going to move Olivia out of the way because we've already talked about that. So let's talk about what I read this week. And I think we're going to have to say goodbye to Teddy because he's disengaging, and it's going to be a little difficult to do the Friday Reads portion anyway with him here. So bye, Teddy. So the first book that I finished this week was The Coast Road by Alan Murren, which I had barely gotten into when we spoke for my last Friday Reads video, which will be linked down below if you'd like to check that out. And I finished it, and I liked it. So the story about this, you've probably heard it, but I'm going to repeat it quickly, is that I saw this book in like every Irish bookstore that I went into when we were in Ireland in May. And it intrigued me. It sounded really interesting, and I kept not buying it because I hadn't heard anything about it. I didn't know anything about Alan Murren, and I thought, well, you know, I feel like the hardcover, it has the exact same cover design in Ireland, but I feel like the book is a little bit thicker. And for that reason, I thought, well, I'd rather get some paperbacks that I know things about and can bring home with me, or that were bookseller recommendations. So I kept passing this book up, even though I kept running into it and not buying it. And then almost as soon as I got home, it was published in the United States. And MJ in Canada was the first person who said, you should check out this book. And I was like, God, you're kidding me. Where were you when I was in Ireland? And then a couple of other people chimed in and said, hey, there's this book called The Coast Road. And, you know, you always regret the book you don't purchase. And this just perfectly leaned into that. Well, anyway, as I said, it was released in the United States. So I got a copy at Montana Book Company when Joel and I were there, but I ended up listening to it on audio. And the narrator is really great. This is set in 1994 in Ireland in County Donegal. And it is set in the build up to a real life referendum that happened in 1994, where the Irish people voted and allowed divorce to happen. Divorce was illegal before that. And the book sort of deals with the political buildup. One of the primary characters in the book, a woman named Izzy, is married to a politician. And there are a lot of discussions that he has with people about how this referendum will be coming up. And people are sort of debating, like, should the Irish people be able to vote on this? And is divorce illegal? Like, what's going to happen? What will be the ramifications? if divorce is allowed to happen, will society crumble? Well, obviously society has not crumbled, but it's more specifically about the lives of women in this time when divorce was illegal and women were not given the same amount of options as men to live their lives and be independent and not dependent on a husband or just men in general in order to get by in society, and the illusions of freedom that you would have. One of the other primary characters is a woman named Colette, who is a poet, has some level of renown as a poet, and she has left her husband and sons to live with another man in Dublin. That relationship kind of fell through, and she ran into the strictures of society and the barriers of what a woman was capable of doing on her own and how independent a woman was actually capable of being, and started to flounder and run out of money. So now she has come back to this town, which is Ardglass, I believe. And her husband bans her from seeing her sons, especially the young son is the most difficult part, because the middle son has a lot of anger issues and doesn't really want to see her. And yeah, anyway. So that is where the book lives and what is the sort of focus of the book. And there are a lot of characters who will take the focus in different chapters. Sometimes Izzy's son will take over, and I think in at least one chapter, Colette's son takes over. And sometimes the husband will take over. There's a priest who gets into it, and there are other women there's a woman who leases a cottage on her property to Colette, and she will sort of take the focus in some chapters. But Izzy and Colette are the sort of primary narratives that we get throughout the story, especially because, Colette is this sort of tragic figure who tried to strike out on her own and is failing, and now is taken to drink and trying to figure out what to do. And Izzy has been in an unhappy marriage to this politically ambitious man, and he, for instance, in the beginning of the book, that one of the bits of tension between them is that she used to have a shop, and when they got married, he sold the shop without even really consulting her. And so she seems like an independent woman, but she's sort of limited to what her husband will allow her to do. And there's sort of a fight between them, and Colette is almost like a cautionary tale to Izzy, and she feels like a little bit stuck, like, well, if I strike out on my own, what's going to happen to me? Will I be any different than her? Is there a way I could protect myself and learn from what happens to her? But the main tension of it is that Izzy decides to help Colette see her son, because Izzy's son and Colette's son are friends. So she can, under the guise of, say, oh, I'm going to take the boys Christmas shopping in town, it'll be fun. She can just tell Colette, this is where we will be. This is where we'll be shopping. I will let you take your son and go have lunch with him. And that becomes the tension point that everything revolves around in the book. And ultimately, I really like this book. It does give me shades of John McGahern Amongst Women, and I think I probably would have liked this a lot more if I hadn't read Amongst Women when we were in Ireland in May. So I feel like I kept comparing it to a different book that has similar things going on, but that I liked better. And that's a bit unfortunate, because I think this is a very good book and it's a very interesting book. So it's just, interesting when that happens, that you've read something that and then you read something else that kind of reminds you of that, but you like the first one better. But I still think this is a great book. It is well worth your time. I have seen this pop up on a couple of prediction lists for the Booker long list, so we'll have to wait until Tuesday to see if it actually makes it. And if it does, I'm a leg up on one book on the long list. It's something that I've read, and I'm not a person who will ever read an entire long list. I mean, I won't say never. I just feel like I have enough things of my own and going on that I don't want to commit to reading an entire long list. But I always think it's interesting to read or have read some of the books that end up in the mix. So if this does end up in there, I think it would be worthy of a spot on the long list, and we'll have to see what else ends up on it if this does make it before committing to whether or not it should make the short list. But yeah, we'll have to see what the competition is. And it's been interesting because I think the last 2 years, if I'm remembering correctly, the book that ultimately won was one of the least known books when the long list was announced. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Booker Prize this year. But this could be a contender. I've seen it pop up. And again, I'm not doing predictions, but it will be interesting if it does end up on the long list. And especially since I've had this wild journey with this book where it definitely stood out to me in Irish bookstores. And I went to a lot of them. And I just I kept not purchasing it. And as I said, you always regret the book you didn't purchase. So this one definitely came back to haunt me. And I'm glad that I finally did get a copy and did read it. I kind of wish I had done it in Ireland, but oh well. The next book that I finished was the one that I was doing in print, and that was We Burn Daylight by Brett Anthony Johnston. This should be coming out if it's not out already. I think it's coming out this Tuesday, and I have this advanced reader's copy of it. And the sort of log line, like the elevator pitch for this book, is that it is Romeo and Juliet in a doomsday cult. I think I had read about 100 pages of this in my last Friday reads, and I was really enjoying it, especially because I didn't expect it to so closely follow Romeo and Juliet, and it actually kind of does. There are a lot of really clever callbacks to Romeo and Juliet after the first 100 pages, like pretty quickly after the first 100 pages. There's another scene where Roy and Jay, the star-crossed lovers of this version of this story, run into each other, and Jay has climbed up onto a water tower on the compound. So it sort of mirrors the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. She's up high and she sees him, and, anyway. So there are a lot of clever ways of incorporating Romeo and Juliet details into this story. I think my feelings got a little more complicated as the book continued past that first 100 pages. I was kind of fully on board in the first 100, and I ended up disengaging just a little bit. Ultimately, I think this is a good book, and this is sort of a situation like The Guncle Abroad, where I liked a book, but if I really wanted to, I could sit down and complain about it for about 30 minutes. And I'm not going to do that. What I will say is that this is a good book. It asks a lot of really interesting questions, setting it in a doomsday cult inspired by, it was the Branch Davidians and David Koresh in Waco in 1993, is really interesting. And it grapples with a lot of the moral complexity of FBI involvement and whether or not the raid was justified and things like that. I do think it ends up coming down a little too hard on one side of that argument, because there are aspects of the book that are taking place in the present where there's a podcast and there are interviews with people who were involved in this standoff between the FBI and this doomsday cult. And there are even people who take issue with the application of the word cult. Like, oh no, this is a religious group. It doesn't really meet the qualifications of a cult, but it's pretty much a cult. And it grapples a little bit with that sort of tension of like, there's a joke that is repeated in the book. What is the difference between a cult and a religion? About 100 years. And the book sort of deals with that a little bit. But at multiple points, there are people in 1993 and people in the present during these podcast interviews who ask questions about like, why is the FBI getting involved in this? Shouldn't they just let this situation play out and let the leader of this religious group or cult, depending on who you are and what you believe in this, calls himself the Lamb. And people sort of say, like, shouldn't the FBI have not gotten involved, especially when they didn't have evidence of what was going on? They just had suspicions about what was going on. Shouldn't they have just let things play out? And if his followers got disillusioned, then great, it would have disbanded on its own. They didn't necessarily need to. It feels like that gets repeated enough in this book that becomes the argument of the book. And I don't necessarily believe that, because especially when you have people like Roy going on and finding grenades on the compound, it's kind of like, well, the shady suspicions were correct. And when statutory rape is happening on there, and people will constantly be like, oh, yeah, I mean, the statutory rape is bad, but shouldn't the FBI have not gotten involved? It's like, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. So it feels like it starts to fall down on one side. I would also say, I don't really believe Roy and Jay as star-crossed lovers, and part of that comes down to the fact that I think both of them are a little bit flat as characters, and it makes it a little difficult to get invested in their star-crossed lovers story when you don't really believe how quickly they fall in love, how quickly they seem to be tied to each other for all eternity. And we'll kind of leave it at that. I would say ultimately, I think it's a good book. I think it's a really interesting book. I was surprised that a book that it so heavily involves, like a doomsday cult, didn't trigger a lot of my anxiety, and I found it really interesting. And again, I think the book does a lot of really interesting things. I really particularly loved all of the clever plays off of Romeo and Juliet. Another thing I didn't think about in my last Friday reads is that Roy's mother is a nurse. And in the play, Juliet's main companion is a nurse. It's much more like old world notions of what a nurse is, but there's even a play where one of the sort of parental figures, and I use the air quotes because the nurse is not a parent to Juliet in the play, but one of the adult figures in the kids' lives is literally a nurse in this version of it. I just think it has a lot of interesting plays off of that, and it does have a lot of interesting moral conundrums and gray areas in the book, but I just feel like maybe a doomsday cult is not the right setting for that, because when bad things are happening and statutory rape is happening and they're arming themselves, it's a little hard to stand back and say, oh yeah, this is a total gray area. But anyway, I thought it was a really interesting book, and I'm glad I read it. I just feel like I could pick it apart with little things that bothered me, kind of like I did with The Guncle Abroad. But ultimately, I thought it was a good book, and I'm glad I did read it. The other book that I managed to finish this week was The Lights on Knockbridge Lane by Roan Parrish. This is something that Joel read in June, I think, at some point in the first half of 2024. And he really liked it. I believe he had mentioned it in his best books of 2024 so far. I'll link that video down below as well. It had been recommended to him by Danny, who is that bookish bear on Instagram. And when he read it and liked it so much, I decided I would do it in July, sort of a Christmas in July thing. You can imagine I am someone who's all on board with Christmas in July or Christmas in March or April or whenever. Did I mention that we have a permanent Christmas village downstairs in our house? We do. I had also been thinking with, election and stress and blah, 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 a male-for-male romance would be just the trick at some point in the month of July. And it was correct. I really kind of hit a point where I needed that sort of cinnamon bun energy, and it definitely did the trick for that. And Christmas is kind of low-key in the book, despite the fact that it's all over the jacket for the book, and the lights are Christmas lights. And the plot kind of revolves around Christmas lights, but Christmas itself feels sort of in the background for most of the book. It's almost like an afterthought, despite the fact that Christmas lights are the plot of the book. Even when you get to Christmas Eve, they haven't gotten a Christmas tree yet. So it's almost like Christmas gets like packed into the last 2 or 3 chapters of the book. So if you're thinking, I don't want to do this because Christmas is not my vibe right now, Christmas is actually not that much of the focus of the book. Although the premise is that you have this single father. There's this kind of trope where if you have a single father in a male-for-male romance, you have to find a way for him to have a child. So usually either he has been married in the past before coming out, and he could be bisexual or gay, or he has a sibling who really only exists as a plot device to have a child, give custody of that child over to their sibling, and then just disappear completely. And in this book, it's the latter. He has a sibling who had become pregnant, and wanted to keep the baby, but didn't actually want the baby. So he agreed to take Augusta, or Gus, as she is nicknamed. He was in a relationship with another man who turned out not to want to be a parent. That's another kind of trope in these single dad gay romances. And so the other guy is out of their lives at this point, and because he decided he didn't want to be a father, he really hasn't been involved in Gus's life. He's kind of vanished. So now that they've moved to a new town, our protagonist, whose name I completely forget at this point, I want to say it's like Matt or Adam. It's something like that. And he wants his daughter to have a good, happy time. So she says she would like to have the most Christmas lights of any house. And he is trying to do that on a budget because he can't really afford to just go out and buy a bunch of Christmas lights and make this magical thing. There's another man who lives across the street. His name is Wes, and he is known as a recluse. There are a lot of rumors about him because he is such a recluse, and because there are green lights that sort of glow out of his basement windows in the evenings. There are rumors that he's like a vampire or a werewolf or a witch and all of these things. And because he doesn't really come out of his house, people just are free to sort of speculate and say whatever they want about him. Other protagonists and Gus come into his lives because Gus, she breaks into his house, which is kind of like, oh, that's, she's supposed to be a good kid and she broke into somebody's house. And when her father tries to say to her, that's not a good thing, she's like, but Dad, I wanted to find out what the glow is. It's like, well, anyway, that's how they meet. And then she really likes Wes, so they keep running into each other, and then chemistry happens, and you get a story. It was fun. I definitely see why Joel liked it, and Danny, because especially as you get into the end, there are some really sweet messages about, you know, family and chosen family and ways of living your life, and it ends up being really cute. I'd say for the first half, or maybe 60 to 70% of the book, it is a fairly standard male for male romance, and then that last part really ends up being cute. But that's good because it leaves you with a very good impression of the book, and that is exactly what I needed and wanted in this moment. So, what am I reading right now? I wrestled back and forth with 3 of the books that I had in my July book haul, which will be, again, linked down below. And the one I ultimately decided to go with is Do Tell by Lindsay Lynch. Part of the reason that this one had a leg up is that I had already read the first chapter, or most of the first chapter, when I decided to order a copy of this book. I got it from the library as a sort of trial run to see if I was going to like it and if I wanted to order it. Lindsay Lynch is one of the book buyers at Parnassus Books. Look at this. I themed my t-shirt to what I'm currently reading. Can you imagine it? I do that a lot. She features very heavily in the Laydown Diaries videos that they do every Tuesday when there are new book releases as such. And she published this book around the same time that Ann Patchett published Tom Lake, and went on book tour with Ann Patchett because Ann Patchett seems to be a very kind person who has clearly wanted to help out a debut author who she knows really well. Anyway, this one came out in paperback. Tom Lake is still not in paperback because it's, selling really well. I had always been curious about it, but for some reason, only when it came out in paperback did I say, you know what, I'm going to do this trial run. I'm going to get it from the library and see if I like it. Well, I really liked the first chapter, so I ordered it, and here it is. And it's still, at this point, I started over. So the only part of this book I have read is still the first chapter, but that's okay. And I'll just tell you again, I ordered this from, Parnassus, because if you're going to order the book, of course, why not order it from where Lindsay Lynch herself works? And the people at Parnassus are so nice. I've called them, I think, 3 times at this point to order things, and they're just so nice over the phone and helpful. So one of the first questions they asked was, well, hardcover or paperback, because they still have a bunch of hardcover copies of Do Tell. And then she said, well, we have all of our copies are signed, but I can get you a personalized one if you want. And I said, oh, no, that's fine. It doesn't have to be personalized. And they said, well, it's really not a problem. She's actually working here today, and she loves signing the books. So it says, to Greg, let's gossip Lindsay Lynch. And I just find that really sweet and cute. So the premise of this one is that it's set in old Hollywood, and it has this old Hollywood look to it. It's she describes it as a sort of gossipy, fun celebrity book. Basically, you have a woman who has been a contract actress at a major studio, and if you're unfamiliar, back in the days of old Hollywood, you were contract players. You were contracted to a studio, and basically the studio kind of owned you. They could tell you what movies you would make and what movies you wouldn't make. You were not necessarily free to make movies with other studios. If you wanted to, or if someone from another studio wanted you, you would have to be loaned out as part of your contract, and there'd be sort of a negotiation between the 2 studios about what they would get out of this arrangement. So having a contract with a studio was really the only way to be an actor in old Hollywood, and it meant a lot of how much agency you would have. Like, you can hear horror stories. Like Marilyn Monroe, part of the reason she ended up such an addict was contract and the way the studio controlled everything that she could do. We're not going to get into that too much. But anyway, so she has been a contracted actress, like a minor actress, and her contract is about to end, and she knows that it's not likely to be picked up because she is a moderately successful actress. And she's aging, and she knows that moderately successful actresses who are starting to get older, and in this case older is like in your 30s, she's unlikely to be picked up again. So she sort of pivots to a career writing a gossip column called Do Tell. And there's a Me Too angle because an actress comes to her with an accusation of sexual assault. And there are also issues of complicity when, as a gossip columnist, you need to work within the studio system to get stories and access. You need access. So it's going to be an interesting book, and I thought the first chapter was really great. So I'm looking forward to getting further into this book. That's Do Tell by Lindsay Lynch. The audio. So I have been all over the place, not really able to decide on what audio I'm going to do. I tried 3 different books and only made it 5 to 10 minutes into them before I even started The Lights on Knockbridge Lane. And then that process started to repeat once I finished The Lights on Knockbridge Lane. I tried 2 different audios and really was just, it's not that the books were bad. I just really wasn't in the mood for the ones that I picked up. And then randomly, I opened Instagram, and the first thing I saw was a reel from a publisher talking about The History of Sound, a story collection by Ben Shattuck. And it was talking about the audio. Now, I've seen good reviews of The History of Sound. They actually had a copy of it at Montana Book Company, and I picked it up and thought, this seems really interesting. I should look for this at some point. What Ben Shattuck was talking about in the reel was the amazing cast that they have for the audio. So this is a story collection. Different people read each story. And the cast includes Chris Cooper, Ben Shattuck himself reads a story. Ed Helms reads a story. Paul Mescal reads a story. Jenny Slate, who is Ben Shattuck's wife, reads a story. And one thing I also hadn't known is that the title story, The History of Sound, is being made into a movie that I think will be coming next year, starring Paul Mescal. And that is the first story, and that is the only one that I've listened to at this point. I've actually only listened to half of that first story. I listened to it on Wednesday before I went to my friend's house for dinner and before, mayhem happened with the storm, and I haven't gotten back to it since. And what's interesting is that, so it's being adapted into a movie starring Paul Mescal. Paul Mescal does read a story in this collection, but he doesn't read the title story. Chris Cooper reads the title story, but it makes more sense because the story is being told from the perspective of that character in 1984 when he's an older man, and he's sort of looking back at this relationship he had with another man in 1916-17 in that area. So it makes sense for the movie to star Paul Mescal when it centers what was going on in that man's young days. But it makes sense for Chris Cooper to read the story because he's reading it from that perspective of him in later years when he is an older man. And Chris Cooper is an amazing audiobook narrator, as it turns out. So I'm only halfway through that first story, and I'm really liking it so far. So I'm really looking forward to getting further along in this. By the way, I should mention, Paul Mescal, I haven't seen the project that introduced him to most people, which was Normal People, the series adaptation from Sally Rooney's novel. But I have seen him in Aftersun, which I thought he was fantastic in. That is such a good movie. Emotionally devastating, but really good. And he really deserved his Best Actor nomination at the Oscars for that, I would say. And then last year I saw him in All of Us Strangers, which is another really good movie. So I'm really excited to see him in The History of Sound when that is released next year. So anyway, that's what I've been reading and doing this week. I'd love to hear what you've been reading and all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.